Chapter 9. A fine state of affairs. A fine state of affairs. We live our lives, and we don't even try to figure out what our society is all about. And yet it is one of the most important questions in life. It's one that's troubled me for a long time now. I really wanted Anastasia to have a look at the documents on the building of the domains which I had brought with me, along with my appeal to the President of Russia and the draft legislation drawn up by my readers. After thinking it over, however, I decided not to show these documents to Anastasia. I did not want to risk upsetting her, especially now, if it turns out that she's pregnant. She needs positive and not negative emotions. I finally decided to give the whole packet of documents to Anastasia's grandfather and ask him for his opinion. "Oh!" acclaimed grandfather as he took the voluminous packet from my outstretched hands and remarked, "What do you want me to do, Vladimir? Read all this?" "Yeah, I want to hear your opinion about them, about how things have turned out." "And what good will that do you?" "It would help me decide what course of action to follow." "You ought to be deciding your own course of action, without any kind of advice." "Does that mean you're not willing to read those?" "All right, I'll read them, just so that you won't take offense." "I shan't take offense. What sense is there in reading if you're obviously reluctant to do so?" "Sense. The sense is not wasting time on useless stuff." Grandfather sat down on the ground beneath the cedar, opened the folder, and began leafing through the pages, taking his time. Occasionally, his gaze would pause and focus on a particular page. Sometimes he just kept turning the pages with a passing glance. After a while, he said, "Vladimir, I need to look at everything carefully. Why don't you go take a walk in the meantime?" I walked about 20 meters off and began pacing back and forth, waiting for him to finish reading the documents I had brought with me, including the articles prepared by the almanac. I would like to share these with you too, dear readers. Footnote: the almanac, see footnote in Book 7, Chapter 28, to the readers of the Ringing Cedars series. Talking with Presidents. Please tell me, esteemed sirs, all you presidents, prime ministers, and chancellors, who in fact is in control of nation-states? The question may seem strange at first glance. Any schoolchild will offer the reply: countries are under the control of the president and the government, the Duma. Footnote: Duma, the lower house of the Russian parliament. But an answer like that simply points to the extent of the mass illusion at work here, and not just in our country. All sorts of ordinary people are under the spell of this illusion, just like the rulers themselves. It can and must be dispelled with the aid of logical thinking. Those who are unable to discern the illusoriness engendered upon the earth will die without having really lived, because the whole of their so-called life is but an illusion. And so, how to dispel this illusion? First of all, we should define what it means to control a nation. In the main, and perhaps exclusively, this refers to the control of social processes and phenomena. The chief person in this control system is called a president. So let's ask him. Tell us, please, Mr. President, are you in charge of drug addiction in our country? No, the president will reply. I'm not in charge of that. What about the rapid development of prostitution? No, I'm not in charge of that either. And what about widespread corruption and bribery? No. And the extinction of our population? What are you talking about? I'm not in charge of anybody's extinction. Sorry about the accent, I don't know. There are a whole lot of questions which he would have to answer with the phrase, "No, I'm not in charge of it." He has, in fact, no alternative, since giving any other answers would brand the ruler a criminal. So it turns out that there are unmistakable large-scale processes taking place in society, influencing the lives of every single individual. But the supreme ruler and a whole host of officials under his command have nothing to do with these processes. What then are they, in fact, in charge of? Upon closer inspection, all they do, it turns out, is involuntarily and unwittingly supervise the concealment of the true rulers who, you see, really do have a reason to hide. In any case, no president, chancellor, or prime minister can possibly be the real ruler of a nation, either in theory or in practice. Their only task is to carry out someone else's will under the guise of their own, and this can be attested by scholars, psychologists, for example. You and I can come to a similar conclusion if we make a careful analysis of our own lives. Haven't our own lives been influenced by someone, say, in kindergarten, school, or college? If they want to, they can bring us up to be communists, or fascists, or Democrats, as in our present situation. And through this process of upbringing and indoctrination, they engender the corresponding social processes. Reality should be determined only through one's own self, Anastasia has said. Her words are good and true, but to understand reality, we need to reflect and contemplate. However, our prevalent way of life leaves precious little time for reflection, and so by default we use someone else's definition of reality that has been imposed upon us. In the case of a head of state, he has even less time for reflection than ordinary people. His daily schedule is calculated down to the hour and minute, and not often by himself. History also teaches us the impossibility of a universally visible ruler actually controlling a nation-state. It is known, for example, that in ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was raised by priests. Naturally, they knew in advance what many of the pharaoh's future decisions would be, but even during the tenure of his reign, they would still keep giving him advice. So in actual fact, the pharaoh was merely carrying out somebody else's will. Rulers in the Orient also had wise men at their courts and consulted with them, but neither the Egyptian priests nor the Oriental court wise men, nor the sages of our virtuous period, ever burdened themselves with the affairs of the state. Their principal task was that of analysis and reflection. Not affording such an opportunity to our present rulers and parliamentarians renders them incapable of exerting an effective influence on the processes taking place in society. It deprives them of power. This was confirmed to me by a well-known 3-term deputy of the Legislative Assembly, who is also a professor with a PhD in economics. But he confirmed this only after serving his parliamentary terms, when he finally had the opportunity to engage in reflection and analysis. It was confirmed in the scandalous incident reported in the press when a deputy of the present Duma complained to the Constitutional Court that the President's Deputy Chief of Staff advised a group of State Duma representatives in no uncertain terms to not reason things through, but simply to vote as they were told. Incredible as it may seem, the Deputy Chief of Staff perhaps intuitively turned out to be the closest of all to the truth. It was far quicker and more efficient for him to make decisions on his own than to have a crowd of people beating their brains out over these decisions, a crowd of people who didn't have the opportunity to think. This conclusion is confirmed by the fact that none of the parties in the State Duma have put forward even a slightly articulate platform that the public can understand. The situation with the ideas and program already put forward by Anastasia offer the clearest evidence of the inability. The situation with the ideas and program already put forward by Anastasia offer the clearest evidence of the inability of the existing system to engage in independent decision-making. Anastasia's program has been supported by a great many people, and as studies have shown, the overwhelming majority of these people lead a sober lifestyle and are inclined to reflection. Vast numbers of people in different parts of the country have overcome great challenges in their efforts to implement this program. On the governmental level, however, there are people who seem incapable of even seeing what is going on in the public arena. Not only that, but counteraction has begun which has served to highlight precisely the influence foreign powers have been exerting on Russia, and the fact that the country is far from being under the control of its own government. This counteraction, of course, does not come from the ranks of the priests who plan out programs for centuries and millennia to come. It is simpler and more specific, and arises from the current system of world order, in which Russia has been assigned to the role of a supplier of raw materials for the West and a market for its substandard merchandise. By the West, I do not mean ordinary people of Europe or America. I'm talking about a group of transnational companies and financiers who are interested in their own profits. As we can all attest for ourselves, over the past decades, their plans have been implemented at an alarming rate, while our rulers, to say the least, have done nothing to prevent this implementation. This is another fact clearly testifying to their lack of any kind of true power or authority. The only counteraction to the destruction of the state and the annihilation of a significant part of its population is the program put forward by Anastasia. But, the majority of my readers might reasonably argue, why do you continue to appeal to those who have no power and are incapable of changing anything? I shall respond. 1, I am appealing, after all, not only to the authorities, but in the first instance to you, dear readers, in the hope that our combined efforts will enable us to understand the situation we find ourselves in the hope that this situation will come out in your interpretation in family chronicles. This is an absolutely vital step. Otherwise, not only we, but our children too, will have an unenviable future to look forward to. 2, I remember Anastasia's question. But who is to blame for the lack of acceptance of truth? The one who does not accept the truth, or the one from whom he receives it? Quoted from Book 2, Chapter 7, Who is to blame? I think that I am partly to blame for the lack of sufficient governmental support offered to those who have begun to set up their domains. I was not able to express the idea in a language government officials could understand. Sure, we all speak the same Russian language, but different segments of the population use it differently and attach different interpretations to words. In short, I am unable to express myself in a language government officials understand. The president's administration, the government, and the Duma are all comprised of people, just like you and me. They too have children, wives, and grandchildren, for whom, as would any other parent, they wish a bright future. And if they should prove capable of understanding the situation, they will gain true power and will be in a position to significantly influence the positive processes taking place in our society. But where and how can we find the words capable of putting an end to this vanity of vanities? Footnote, vanity of vanities, quoted from Ecclesiastes 1:2. Whatever. We must look, otherwise new politicians will appear and will come up against the same system blocking their thought. Here I am appealing to you, my readers, with a request to find together the words which will be understood by the various segments of our society. And so for the umpteenth time, I stand my ground and appeal to our president and government. To the president and the government of the Russian Federation. As supreme ruler of the Russian state, you are undoubtedly more interested than anyone else in the prosperity of our country. Like any head of state, you would like to be recognized by the public for having left the brightest of all possible legacies during your tenure in office, namely, laying a foundation for the prosperity of our nation and its people. Similarly, every Russian family desires to shape its life and daily routine in a manner worthy of human existence. Every mother who bears a child dreams about a happy future for her offspring, realizing that such a future is possible only when the nation as a whole is heading in a clear and predictably good direction. It is on this premise that you are endeavored to build our national institutions, our government, our ministries, and our regional authorities. Nevertheless, no matter how sincere your desires and the endeavors of our state apparatus may be, Our country continues to be plagued by corruption, drug addiction, prostitution, juvenile crime, and many other social ills. Our environmental and demographic situation is becoming hopelessly entangled. Families are falling apart. The country's overall population is in daily decline. We as people are simply dying out. Everything you are doing is extremely important. The consolidation of vertical power structure, the reorganization of the state apparatus, the reform of the military, the doubling of the GDP and the economic sector. All our national indicators are on the plus side. The dynamics are positive, but the public does not feel it. The people of our country, our neighbors, colleagues, and coworkers, relatives, parents, and children are all finding it more and more difficult to understand each other, to find kind and sympathetic words to say to each other, to build their mutual relationship on the basis of honesty, decency, and trust. Fear for tomorrow, for the future of their children, shows no signs of letting up. Are not these the most important indicators to consider? We see signs of an increasingly active struggle against social ills, but these ills are not abating. Why not? Why do the people's desires and the president's endeavors not correspond with what is happening on the ground? Isn't it time we faced the truth squarely in the eye and came to the conclusion that we are struggling merely with effects, not with their underlying causes? Isn't it time for you to openly admit that our country is playing host to an ideology foreign to our society, and realize that there are certain definite forces underlying many of our ongoing social ills? As a professional KGB man, you couldn't help but be aware of this. These forces have made such fools of our people that we are beginning to suffer from tunnel vision. Take a simple example, advertising. Both learned psychoanalysts and ordinary people will tell you that mass advertising is nothing but a device which exerts a powerful influence on the human psyche. With the aid of this device, people in many countries can be persuaded to consume food products which are harmful to their health, or wear uncomfortable clothing, or vote for certain politicians. And this device, which can exert a colossal influence on masses of people, seems to be in your hands, in the hands of our national government. Isn't that so? Most definitely not. It is actually subject to other masters. Attempts to bring resolution to this question immediately give rise to accusations of violating freedom of speech. These accusations come from those who actually have no interest whatsoever in promoting people's freedom of speech. The mass media are, in fact, in the hands of the world's financial magnates. And they keep spreading this monstrous lie among whole populations, hiding behind the cynical excuse that is advertisers who support all TV and all the interesting programs that we so love to watch. But in fact, TV is not paid for by any advertisers. All they do is pass on a portion of the money they collect from the public, which they build into the cost of their products in order to pay for their advertising on TV, radio, public transport, on the street. Thus, it turns out that the public collectively are the real supporters of TV operations every time they purchase substandard consumer goods and food products containing chemical additives. They support mediocre and downright shoddy TV programs and soap operas, which keep promoting the image of man as a maniacally preoccupied Neanderthal. The science of imagery and who governs the country's ideology. Throughout history, national ideologies have been created through devices which exert an influence on human society through images, through the clandestine ancient knowledge of the science of imagery. Some of our learned chaps might object that there is no such science, but there is. And its existence is determined not by the will of the academics, but by the very nature of man. Man is created to think, and thoughts, in turn, form images. In recent times, we are wont to associate the science of imagery with ancient Egypt. We learn from history how priests collected images to liberate nation states or seize power over whole peoples. It was the same kind of knowledge that the SS troops attempted to master in Hitler's army, or the KGB's Division 13 in Soviet times. Footnote: Division 13, designating the unit of the KGB responsible for covert operations including sabotage, assassination, and even terrorism. Certain elements of this science are intuitively employed by modern political technologists in the West, and more recently in our own country, hence the terminology image-making way of life, way of thinking, and a candidate's image. Footnote: way of life, way of thinking. Both these terms in Russian contain the word for image, or obraz. To the political technologists, it is quite unimportant what a candidate's inner aspirations are, what kind of man he is, whether or not he is good at his job. Money and the mass media help them create an image which will appeal to the public. And what people end up voting for in elections is not so much the man himself as the image created for him by the political technologists. It won't be long before we'll all be voting for cardboard cutout politicians and papier-mâché presidents. As for the shaping of images for whole nation states and their peoples, there are the masterpieces of an incomparably higher rank species of political technologists. Centuries of human history have borne witness to a host of examples of controlling a nation-state through images. The most salient and obvious example for people today of the work of these top-ranked political technologists, or modern priests, may be the history of our country and its peoples over the past century. We all know about the downfall of the Soviet Union, one of the mightiest empires in the world. But what preceded the formation of the USSR, and what gave rise to its subsequent collapse? Precedent to the formation of the USSR was the creation of an attractive image of a socialist future and then of a communist state. Landowners and manufacturers were cast in the image of bloodsuckers of the proletariat. The Tsar, T-S-A-R, still reigned in Russia, and the monarchy seemed unshakable, yet at the same time, an image was at work which was busy attracting followers, and these in turn found all sorts of ways to bring down the monarchy and create a new state in the new image. The fall of the USSR was also preceded by the creation of an image of the country in a totalitarian state, along with the discussion on the need to replace it with a new one, a happy, free, democratic state along Western lines. The government and leaders of the communist state were cast in the role of bloodthirsty thugs, trampling on freedoms and on people themselves. The socialist order was painted as intolerable and leading nowhere. The image of communists created by theater and cinema directors, actors, and artists, on which whole generations of the populace had been raised, was now summarily shunted aside. But what was there to take its place? The resulting vacuum began to be filled with images of flourishing businessmen, gangsters, prostitutes, and Hollywood starlets. Our young people strove to imitate their habits and morals. There is no disputing the fact that material wealth is fast becoming the criterion by which prosperity is measured. Who attains it and how? That doesn't enter into the picture. They need to build a developed democratic state. The need to build a developed democratic state has been proclaimed to all, but not a word has been, or is being, said about the insurmountable problems in other democratic countries, like drug addiction, colossal corruption, environmental degradation, mental depression, decline in birth rate, and a whole lot else besides. Women naturally refuse to have children when they see no future for their offspring. Never mind that people in democratic countries have no clear picture of their own future, and our modern priests find it necessary to present democracy in its present form as the only acceptable order for the structuring of human society. Why? because the conditions of democracy as we know it make the easiest system to control. It is all too easy to hide behind the freedom of speech, freedom of business, freedom of choice, and meanwhile throw the public a black lie. And this is done not by happenstance, but deliberately and with considerable forethought. Whatever image you latch onto, you yourself will become. What is that? Is that a cat? Sorry. There's an animal out in the yard and I don't know what it is. La, la, la. These political technologists they know what will happen next with the whole population. It's not a difficult task to determine who's behind the disasters happening in Russia. All one has to do is track where the country's precious human and financial resources are being siphoned off to each time. The huge flood of immigration which fled Russia following the 1917 revolution took with it not only a significant amount of capital along with historical treasures and traditions, but most importantly, human resources. After the collapse of the Soviet Empire, a combination of reforms and a tempting image of a prosperous, civilized country siphoned off, and continues to siphon off, our financial and intellectual resources. The saddest part is that the latest image of our state is being summoned in the interests of annihilating the whole country and the peoples living therein. No military intervention is required at all. A more significant force than military weaponry is at work here. An image is at work. A combination of factors already perceivable to analysts has been put into operation. Quite a simple one at that. Quite a simple combination at that. Let's try to reason through it. What are we building today? Where are we heading to? The political technologists tell us they are building a democratic state on the Western model. And so once it is built, we all shall all be rich and happy. But millions of our fellow citizens quite reasonably argue, if there already exist on the earth developed states that are both democratic and happy, then wouldn't it be easier to simply go and live there now? And millions have left and continue to leave for Germany, Israel, and America, putting their intellectual and financial capital at the disposal of those countries. And they become slaves there. The image is working. I think that cat was a baby panther. And I hope I can befriend it so it doesn't grow up and eat me. Or my kid. Back to the book. But what about those left behind in Russia? What are they to do? Build a developed democratic state and become rich, says the image. But what can a traffic cop say do to build such a state? Or a sales clerk in a store? Or a civil servant in an administration office? That's not clear to many people. Neither is it clear how one is supposed to become rich on a salary of 3,000 to 5,000 rubles a month. Footnote, in 2005, when this book was written, this represented approximately 100 to 175 US dollars, respectively, at then the current exchange rate. US 200 to 350 in buying power. Wow, a month. Yikes. But quite a number, after all, have somehow managed to wangle their way through. They drive around in expensive cars, build themselves luxury mansions and holidays at fancy resorts. Somehow they've wangled their way through. And now the whole country is beginning to follow their example. Sales clerks and customers, traffic cops and office administrators, army officers and private soldiers, teachers and students. But those who know the science of imagery merely scoff at such efforts. Come on, they say. Catch a few scapegoats among the officers' ranks, then you can create a security service within the security service. Here we are fighting not against causes, but against effects. The image has already done its work. Sorry. The image has already done its work. It is capable of entering unhindered into the minds of politicians and generals, high-ranking government officials, and ordinary people. Because it is image, it knows neither border guards nor closed office doors. It lures young girls from isolated Russian villages to faraway lands with its promises of a happy life, and then forces them to work as prostitutes in Cyprus, Israel, or New York. For the sake of this promise of a happy life, officials are ready to take bribes, and policemen go into cahoots with criminals. This image has tremendous energy. In the meantime, all our politicians can do is keep mouthing over and over the hackneyed phrases like developed democratic countries, the civilized West, thereby serving to reinforce the image that is so destructive to our country. People are aware there's something wrong with the country, and so they understand when you, Vladimir Vladimirovich, President Putin's first name and patronymic, attempt to impose order. But how to accomplish this? Just consolidating your hold on power is not enough. In doing this, you are strengthening not just your own power, but the power of the images too. Thousands of government officials now have more power, but under the influence of the image, they will unwittingly act in the interests of the image. In other words, the interests of the image's creators. But the creators have already decided that Russia's fate is sealed. Their actions have become unbridled and brazenly bold. Specially trained personnel have been sent to Russia for the purpose of strengthening the creator's power by supporting an image which can only destroy the country. I can officially state that right at this moment, specially trained people are operating on Russian territory, people whose job it is to keep track of and correct when necessary the ideology component of the state. I have a feeling you, Mr. President, are aware of this too. Let us give some thought as to why there have been so few positive images over the past few years in our nation's literature, film, and TV programs. Images capable of inspiring people, setting a pattern to follow, and helping build a marvelous future for their children. We still remember and live by those images. But our children? We are assured that this is the demand of the majority, that everybody wants to watch only Hollywood starlets, gangster showdowns, and sensational reports on bloody happenings. It's nonsense. It's not what people want. We are told, if you don't want it, then don't watch it. If you don't like it, don't listen. That's called freedom of choice, but that's not quite the way it is, or rather, it's not the way it is at all. There is no choice here, not for children, not for adults, and certainly not for senior citizens. And unless you happen to be cold-hearted, cynical, and soulless, you'll discover the road to promised prosperity is blocked. And there is no other road. Isn't that the case all around you? All around us? All of this depravity is being deliberately foisted upon us. Special covert selection mechanisms were put in place long ago. Any poets, innovative educators, writers, and directors who have dared create positive images for Russia are cruelly prosecuted. Everything is simply closed to them. This is partly the work, too, of the Western spy agencies that claim to be fighting sectarianism. You can hear such declarations coming from the mouths not just of Russian special service agents, but from social and political activists as well, including the highest officials of the Russian president's administration, your administration. For example, Mr. Surkov, your deputy chief of staff, said during a newspaper interview, footnote, Vladislav Yurovich Surkov, the Russian president's deputy chief of staff since 1999. During the previous decade and a half, Surkov held executive positions with various Russian financial institutions and media organizations. He said this during a newspaper interview. A secret war is being waged against Russia by circles in America, Europe, and the Orient, who still regard our country as a potential enemy. They consider themselves to have rendered a service in fostering the virtually bloodless collapse of the Soviet Union, and now they are attempting to capitalize on their success. Their goal is none other than the destruction of Russia and the filling of its vast spaces with a multitude of petty quasi-states. Such a statement is entirely plausible, even if just because the forces that overthrew the USSR still exist and, quite naturally, not satisfied with having achieved victory at one stage, they will definitely continue with a stepped-up offensive. And it is especially important here, not just to state facts, but to understand the mechanism by which the destructive influence operates. We already know that the collapse of the USSR was brought about not through armed invasion, but as the result of an ideological manipulation of our people. Ideology, that is the principal means of either annihilating or reinforcing any nation-state. But any ideology can be used to influence masses of people if it has a well-built and efficient operating structure. It exists, and it is not ours. It is not our images that are acting through it. But where has our own structure disappeared to? We destroyed it. In the USSR, apart from its ideological institutions and broadcast centers, the ideological department of the Communist Party's Central Committee, the Ministry of Culture and the Press, there was a huge network including so-called palaces of culture and houses of culture, along with urban and rural district activity clubs. Footnote, these functioned along the lines of community centers, including concert halls and recreation centers to provide ideologically approved entertainment and recreational facilities for the public in Soviet times. Such institutions afforded the opportunity for millions of young Soviet citizens to engage in amateur artist and performance circles, including the holding of lectures and the meetings, as well as the opportunity for the accepted state ideology to get through and be explained to the masses. At the beginning of perestroika, when the ideology changed, this network of institutions was liquidated. Their financing was cut off. It is difficult to imagine that a driver motoring along the highway who suddenly realizes he is heading in the wrong direction, instead of turning around and heading the right way, begins to dismantle his car on the spot. But something like that is what happened in our country when the decision was taken in society, not without the aid of certain forces, of course, that we were headed in the wrong direction. Instead of turning around and using existing institutions, they were simply dismantled. And what was there to take their place? It was proposed to hand over the basic task of spiritually educating the population, especially the youth, to Russia's Orthodox Church. However, more and more testimonies are indicating that, first and foremost, it is necessary to educate the majority of the clergy itself. As an institution of spirituality, Russia's Orthodox Church was catastrophic in its failure to justify the hopes placed in it. Why? Simply because, through the help of the state, it only took a few years to open 20,000 churches, while it requires centuries and a host of strict conditions to educate 20,000 highly spiritual clerics who are truly capable of comforting and educating other people. And not the kind of conditions as when the state pours forth grants and favors which only corrupt and attract opportunists and vagabonds. In that scenario, the winners are not those pastors who are rich in spirit, but those who are more devious and position themselves closer to the trough. It is not the congregation led by a spiritually minded prior that comes out on top, but the one that manages to obtain financing. After all, the process of attracting parishioners and raising their level of spirituality is a lengthy one. It can drag on for years, so the village priest is obliged to mend his own frock, unable to afford a new one, while his urban counterpart drives around in an expensive foreign car. The acquisitiveness and covetousness already plaguing the clerics of Russia's Orthodox Church was brought up during a speech at the annual meeting of the Moscow Diocese, Diocese, in the Cathedral Church of Christ the Savior on the 15th of September 2004 by Alexei II, the Holy Patriarch of Moscow and all the Russias, when he said, "There's a lot of footnotes, but I don't want to read them." When he said, "Today we are obliged to confront a series of negative phenomena, including the general static state of the Church's activity, the absence of dynamics in congregational life, the low attendance by worshippers at temple services, and the lack of interest in religion on the part of the rising generation. The growing commercialization of many aspects of congregational life is an alarming indicator that the dying out of the Orthodox consciousness, spiritual blindness, and the disparagement of ecclesiasticism, material self-interest, all too often comes to the fore, overshadowing and stamping out everything living and spiritual. All too often, temples deal church services as though they were commercial firms. Nothing pushes people away from the faith as much as the selfishness of priests and others who serve in the temples. It is with good reason that the covetousness is termed a hateful, murderous passion and the only treason in respect to God. In other words, a hellish sin. The Patriarch outlawed taking payment for performing church sacraments, the rituals of communion, marriage, last rites, and burial services, as well as commercializing the services of the church. But will clerics heed the ban imposed by the supreme church hierarchy if they already transgress a higher law, the commandments of God? Russia's Orthodox Church. But is it Russia's? Apart from everything else, Western spy agencies have exerted what may be the strongest and most destructive influence on Russia's Orthodox Church, or ROC. And this could have been foreseen, of course, if someone had only been assigned to foresee it. Footnote: ROC, traditionally known as the Russian Orthodox Church, notes that the author deliberately uses the word Rossiyskaya in this phrase, emphasizing its association with Russia, or the Russian Federation, as a political entity rather than Russkaya, which is more a reference to the Russian people, language, and culture. See also Book 7, footnote 11 in Chapter 15, Opposition, as well as footnote 3 in Chapter 20, Pagans. What? We know that the major shifts in our country are always preceded by an ideological makeover. Could the departments of Western spy agencies responsible for the transformations in Russia required by their masters leave untouched such an important institution as ROC? Of course not. Otherwise, their work would not be professional. Besides, the conditions in Russia at the time offered more than fertile ground for ideological diversion. Occupied with their own reorganization, our spy agencies, to put it mildly, were busy with the internal settling of accounts, which I believe is still going on. It's impossible to know about every single operation perpetrated by a Western spy agency through ROC structures, but one in particular has struck a chord in society as a whole. Millions of Russian citizens, including the Church's own clerics, have felt and continue to feel its destructive consequences. I'm talking here about the agency formed under the aegis of ROC, with labels such as sects. a wide range of secular and religious organizations, thus provoking negative reactions to ROC on their part. These anti-sectarians have been acting in the name of the Church, and even, as they claim, with the blessing of the Patriarch Alexei II. Alexei, I don't know. In response to their actions, people who formerly maintained a tolerant attitude toward the Church, or even attended services as baptized members, have now simply torn off the crosses they used to wear around their necks. One more ploy of the anti-sectarians, in working to expose their straw man sects, they virtually criticized and brought shame upon Russia's Orthodox Church itself, dealing it a serious blow. After that, they decided to take control of the higher organs of state power and the Russian Federation. Having accepted the idea of a marvelous future for Russia, as shown in these books, with their heart and soul, people in various parts of Russia have turned, and continue to turn, to local administrations, asking them to grant them plots of land for the setting up of family domains. And what is truly amazing, people for the first time are not asking favors or salary or pension supplements, but simply a small piece of their country's natural landscape where they can create their own living and not just survival conditions. It would seem that this impulse, which has arisen among the public, is something that ought to be welcomed with open arms. This impulse is no fly-by-night whim, but a lasting, well-thought-through desire in the past 4 years, as the past 4 years will attest. This idea has encompassed various segments of the population: school pupils, scholars and entrepreneurs, teachers, doctors, pensioners, soldiers, politicians, artists, poets, and writers, including academicians. Footnote, academicians, members of the Russian Academy of Sciences, a very high rank indeed. Governors and the wives of presidents as former Soviet republics. These people cannot only, these people can help not only in solving many of these socio-economic problems our country is facing, but also in making drastic improvements in our country's demographic situation, unemployment rate, and national health, as well as in securing safe food supplies. But the main thing is to harness the mighty force of the people themselves who, in creating their own space, will strengthen their beloved country and nation state, which has afforded them the opportunity to do so. True story. Evidently, however, there is someone who is greatly displeased by these positive aspirations which have emerged in the Russian people. Occupiers in action. Certain government agencies at the regional and sometimes even local level have been advised to treat the readers of my books as sectarians and terrorists, and consequently to counteract any initiative they may undertake, especially those wishing to set up their own family domains in rural areas. The mass media were ordered, under threat of sacking journalists, not to report on these initiatives, or if there were any reference, it had to describe them as part of the loony fringe, calling everybody to go to the forest, back into the past, etc. People working in the cultural sector were called upon to take countermeasures against anything connecting with the books or the ideas set forth therein. Communications from readers clearly point to the activities of some sort of organization operating on our national territory through agents in state and ecclesiastical structures and carrying out destructive policies. And don't just take my word for it. This is confirmed by professional researchers who have familiarized themselves with a significant body of collected materials. A special term has even surfaced, the Anastasia cult. And to whom or to what does this term specifically refer? To me as a writer, to my Anastasia book, to the book's heroine, whose name is Anastasia, to the millions of readers of these books, or to the efforts to implement Anastasia's ideas about a marvelous and prosperous Russia. As it turns out, all of the above. It is a sad sight indeed to see both foreign and homegrown clerics, who are definitely not of any Christian faith, occupying the Orthodox Church and exerting their influence on state officials. Christianity for them is only a convenient cover. Their actions show clearly that they are far removed from any Christian morality. Their methods are old hat, the same methods of falsehood and violence that were used to destroy the culture of ancient Rus in favor of a new ideology foreign to the people. I've written about this in my books. Right off, they began accusing me of paganism. But what kind of accusation is that? It's tantamount to accusing me of the desire to know the history of my country and the culture of my forebears. There is, however, some very happy, encouraging news. Life has begun, more and more, often, to come out with situations where their unseemly actions are exposed as if by an invisible ray of light. It puts them, one might say, in a rather funny predicament. Judge for yourselves.